Well, hello there, and welcome back to the second episode of October of Fabulous Folklore Presents. And this time I'm delighted to introduce you to Scott Richardson-Read. Now, Scott is an independent researcher, published author, and activist, with several master's degrees in research, social sciences, and psychology. His academic background helps him explore Scottish folklore, customs, and traditions, uncovering their relevance today while grounding them in a rich historical and social context. His next book is launching in spring 2025, called Mill Dust and Dreaming Bread, which explores these topics in a new way. Combining academic research, archival work, and hands-on experience, Scott explores the historical roots of Scottish folk practices. With his in the world, off the page approach, he encourages people to take an active role in preserving Scotland's cultural and intangible heritage. Through his work with the Woven Land Network, Scott curates events that bring together experts in Scottish folk magic, music, storytelling, and traditional practices, making these traditions meaningful and accessible today. And in this chat, we're going to talk all about Scottish cosmology, discuss the differences between Scottish folk magic and folk magic practices elsewhere in the British Isles, and talk about the value of ancestor work in Scottish folk magic, among other things. Enjoy. Hello there, and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult, and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author, and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Hello, and welcome to Fabulous Folklore. How are you doing?
I am really good, Icy. Should I call you Dr. Sedgwick, though? Is that like how we should roll, or is it Icy?
You can just call us Icy, that's absolutely fine.
I'm good, Icy, I'm good.
Excellent, excellent. I do actually have a student who calls us doctor, and it always makes me feel a little bit weird every time because I'm like, I haven't graduated yet. Obviously, we are going to be talking about all things sort of Scottish folk magic because that is, I suppose, primarily what you're known for on Instagram, would you say?
Yeah, and also my scintillating wit, I'm sure, is also well known. Yeah, but Scottish folklore for sure.
Cool. So I thought I'd start off with a big question because, we'll get the difficult ones out the way first. How would you describe Scottish cosmology for anyone who might be new to the subject?
I've been exploring a lot to do with Scottish cosmology for a long time, and I'm going to paraphrase it a bit for ease. But if people want to know more, they can go on my website, and there's whole series written about stuff. So if you if people are listening to what I'm talking about and they're like, "You didn't mention a thing," go and read there first, and then at me at the comment if I didn't mention the thing. That's probably the best way to do it. So for me, Scottish cosmology does follow the kind of like tripartite model, which is the three-part model. So some people who are listening might be used to like a four elemental kind of view of the world, but when we look at Scottish cosmology, it's very much broken down into three, and three is the magic number in a lot of folk belief across Europe, I would probably argue, along with 9 and 7. But it's to do with the earth, it's to do with the sky, and it's to do with the sea. And a lot of our stories talk about the influences and the influxes of the different characters that live in these different spaces. There's a particular story written about the Cailleach who a man comes to visit her, and it's talking about Luan le Beltane, which is the first day of Beltane, which is the yeah, also excuse my pronunciations if I'm getting them wrong. You can also at me about that too. Luan le Beltane is the first day of Beltane, but it's like a euphemism for like the start of the world. And a guy comes and talks to the Cailleach about tell me about the Luan le Beltane, the start of the world. And she's like, oh, I wish I could, but don't know. I'm not that old, but you should go and pop and see this eagle chap. So he goes to see the eagle chap, and the eagle chap doesn't know, and then he goes to see an otter, and the otter doesn't know, and then finally he goes to speak to the salmon, and the salmon is like, oh yeah, I remember the first day of Beltane. The ice was frozen when I jumped out of it and I landed on it, and something came and pecked my eye out and defrosted the ocean, and that's what the salmon remembers of the first day of Beltane. there's a lot more to that story. Again, like you can listen to it on my YouTube channel and stuff. It's a really beautiful story, but for me, it illustrates very much that idea of a kind of cosmology that sits before the Cailleach even. And for people who know Scottish mythology or not, the Cailleach is like a winter spirit for a lot of people, but she's actually a lot more than that. She's kind of like a creator of the earth and shaper of the world, not just a kind of winter hag spirit thing. And she also has a consort called the Bodach as well, which is really interesting connotations towards Dawn and Lord of the Dead, but that's a whole conversation for a whole other day. But yeah, the idea of that kind of three parts. So everything is made up in Scottish folklore and folk belief of these three parts. We're all made up of like earth and sky and sea. And in some of our stories and in some of the lore, there's kind of, you can see this replicated in some of the kind of 9th century literature from the manuscripts. There's one in Ireland whose name escapes me right now, I see, I'm afraid, that talks about the different temperaments made up of these kind of different interactions of these different cosmologies. And you can see it in the stories of what Gaels are afraid of. They're afraid of like the sky falling down or the earth opening up or the sea rising up. So you kind of know what the world's made of when you see how it's kind of going to end. And I guess it's similar to the idea a little bit of like Ragnarok tells you the story of the end by including what was said at the beginning of the story. So it's kind of that cyclical stuff. So yeah, within those three parts, there are the kind of animism, but they're the kind of three building blocks of that, if you like. And you see this story also uttered again in biblical terms, I guess, with Saint Michael and the big war of heaven and all of this kind of stuff. For people that don't know that, Satan was having a fight with God's hosts of angels, and Saint Michael in one of the versions of the story was like, all of the angels are leaving heaven to have this fight and they're joining Satan and we have to stop it. So said this to God and God just said stop. And then wherever the angels were, they froze. So we got the kind of angels of the sky, the angels of the earth, and the angels of the sea that then became like the ash sheet, the kind of the good folk or the good neighbors, as a biblical retelling of the kind of animism stories that are found. I think just not in Scotland as well. There'll be found very similar stories in Wales and Ireland, I'd imagine, probably Brittany. So yeah, that we see that replicated quite a lot across things, but I think provides a bit of a counterpoint from the four elemental system, which is pretty much a Greek kind of ceremonial idea as well. But I'm not so down on that history. But yeah, that idea that we then live within that space is a really important one as well.
Cool. So do you think that you have anything missing by the lack of fire in there, or do you think that that's a completely different sort of system, so it doesn't really matter?
I don't think it's lacking. I think we have to look at what that means in terms of the stories of how that kind of represents something different, like in the creation of uh I'm looking at the kind of Germanic stuff. Sadly, as records go of cosmology of Gaeldom and in Scottish stuff, there's not very much. So we kind of have to infer quite a lot from other areas. So if you look at the trees, sorry, my cat's joining in the conversation. If you look at trees, form quite a significant role in Gaelic and Scottish lore and folklore and stories. And in the Norse story, people came to life from trees. Was it Ask an Embler? I can't ever remember what their names were, but it was like meant to be an ash tree and maybe a rowan tree, people say. And they were brought to life by the breath of gods, or the breath of ancestor deities, if that's what you want to look at that way. And fire wasn't really part of the cosmology with that, but other people view fire as the kind of inspiration, I suppose, the kind of imbus, the kind of spark that Lucifer brought down as well. And this kind of idea of like, you can be human without that, I guess is an interesting one to kind of unpick. But in terms of the building blocks of stuff, I've been exploring the idea of the Ayurvedic system, which is a system of three rather than a system of four, rather than the kind of Greek kind of four models that we have in Western herbalism as well. It kind of presents a different way of viewing dynamics within a kind of system of three rather than a system of four, which is a bit outside my pay grade for today. I see.
Fair enough. So obviously there's been quite an explosion, I would say, in titles about different types of folk magic over recent years, which is excellent because obviously it kind of brings more voices to the table and more difference to the table. So it's not just this homogenous thing where everyone's resharing the same content. But I'm curious because obviously I've had like Mara on talking about Welsh practices, and obviously I've had Una talking about things from Shetland and so on, and other parts of the British Isles. So what would you say sort of differentiates Scottish folk magic from other folk magic practices in the British Isles, or is it actually pretty similar? It just comes from a different cosmology.
Okay, this is like a practice question, and for me it's also a political question. It's probably also a cultural question, and I don't think there's one right answer with this because it depends where people come from. And I guess at the time of this recording, Alexander Salmond has died, like the guy who said, do you view Scotland is a country, not a county? And it's kind of like that's a bit national. It's nationalist, isn't it? It's kind of like what we talk about. And politically, Scotland views itself as a country, not a county. But also historically, we can look at the kind of the people in Scotland and Ireland as separate from the kind of incursion of Anglo-Saxonness or Norseness or Normanness or Romanness. There's like a kind of indigenous ideology, and I'm really cautious about using the term indigenous. I prefer native because indigenous has too many connotations for me for First Nations people. So like a native idea of things. So there are this kind of view of, okay, what is Scottishness? And I think it can be quite a kind of fractious way of approaching things by saying, what is this, if not in comparison with what it is not? And if we go back to my chat, like we've been invaded, we're a thumbprint of an island, really. We're like in a massive sea, we're a wee thumbprint of an island, and we're an island nation, which means we've always been invaded by folks all the time. So to say what is Scottish practice, I would say Scottish practice or folk belief, and I want to say like working class folk belief, or it is a folk magic. So it's, I don't want to conflate it with witchcraft here or anything like that. So native Scottish folk belief is a melange. It's a mix of like Anglo-Saxon, Old English influences. You can trace trolldom practices, which is Swedish folk magic, Norse influences, there's Roman influences, there's also, of course, Gaelic influences. And it's not any of these separated out that make Scottish folk magic what it is. It's the blend of all of them, and it's the particular circumstances that they blended in this particular part of the world, which makes it unique, but also linked to everything else that is gone on. So you'll find practices that we do in Scotland in Sweden, and you'll find them in Ireland, and you'll find them in France, and you'll find them in Germany. You'll find them everywhere, but they've got different names, but the kind of processes are the same. And I would kind of suggest that the cosmology is pretty much the same. If we remove how the story of how the world began, which is a cosmology story, and we put that on the shelf for a moment, and we look at the building blocks that are within a folk practice, Scotland's very animist, and it's very things animate spaces and they animate people, and they lead to a particular way of being and a cultural way of being, which you see when example is like when your granny self is self-deprecating because you give her a compliment. Scottish people don't take compliments very well. It's like well known. We'll just like black sense of humor, and we'll be like, oh no, that old thing. No. If we look at the practice of the evil eye and what protects us from the evil eye, one of the things, this is a bit of a stretch, but bear with me. One of the things that protects us from the evil eye is depraising the thing that the person gave a compliment to. So we could make out the case that like this practice is so ingrained that it's actually ingrained in the way that we are culturally, that we're like that old thing. No, because the evil eye is a thing. It's still like people still believe in it, and the uncanny eye and all the rest of it. So is it unique? Yes. Is it different? No. Do you know what I mean? We still have similar technologies for navigating the situations we find ourselves in, and it's just expressed in a different way, but we have similarities across like a lot of cultures. And I say that's one of the beautiful things about folk magic and folklore. It unites beyond the borders that we probably have artificially placed on a piece of paper. Well, we haven't placed it, I see. Some guy in government decided to do that. This is Scottish on this side and this is English on the other. But cultures and people, we don't operate like that, do we? We don't stick to a line. So yeah, I'm proud to say, I think, from my point of view, that Scottish folk belief and folk practice is varied. And depending on where you are, there's more of a for instance, more of an emphasis in the west coast and the north. Sorry, for people who can't see, I'm doing the compass in my head and I'm pointing in the sky. The northwest, there's more of a Gaelic focus, and then where I am in the southeast, there's more of a kind of Anglo-Saxon focus. But it's all what you would say is Scottish, I guess, because of the line that's drawn on a piece of paper. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I just kind of went on a bit, a bit of like a diatribe there. I'm not sure. But...
Oh, we do love a good diatribe here on Fabulous Folklore. And obviously, before we started recording, obviously we were talking about borders and things. And I think that's where it's really funny when I look at some of the Scottish beliefs and I look at some of the Northumbrian ones, they're the same. Because obviously when you consider we were the debatable lands back in the day, like England didn't want us and didn't know what to do with Scotland. So we're kind of in that weird liminal place. And that's the first time I've used liminal for a long time. I've done very well there. I think you do have that weird kind of not quite one, not quite the other blending of beliefs. And I suppose that's what humans do, isn't it? Like not to an appropriative sense, but I think, people go, oh, that looks quite good. And then they mix it with something that they know how to do and then create something new.
Yeah, it's the language that we all speak, really. If you want to get kind of a bit meta about it, it's a symbolic language, isn't it? It's like words are symbols, but anyway, it's a way that we see of navigating the world. And even Walter Scott talks about the black books being moved across the border by the moss troopers and stuff. And a black book is the Svartskambøker, like the Cyprian, Cipriani kind of books that contain a lot of Saint Cyprian's supposed kind of sorcery and stuff. We have so Walter Scott's talking about that in the 19th century. Excuse me if I get the dates wrong. So we know there's been this huge blending, and I don't think I think if you view Scotland as a country, there are very specific Scottish practices, but they're not dogmatic. There's no kind of dogma, but there is a kind of, like you mentioned, liminality. There's a kind of respect to changing times and spaces. There's also like a tradition of reciprocity and hospitality, which I think are the three foundational things that are in Scottish folk magic, and probably anyone who's an animist as well. If you start to view yourself in a reciprocal nature with things around you, you can't help but be hospitable, and you can't help but follow these kind of values. So you operate in the world in a different way, and I think you see that played out in Scottish culture a lot with the kind of Cailleachs. And when I say Cailleachs, I don't mean like grab your banjo or your violin and let's do a dance kind of Cailleachs. I mean like the proper kind of winter story time Cailleachs, where people would gather and tell stories and riddles and share the crack basically a little bit, and not just strip the willow dance. And there's all of that kind of shared cultural stuff, and it's very much a kind of oral, or was very much an oral tradition. Where I find the kind of a problematic current within it is where movements might, for instance, say that this practice is theirs and it's only theirs and it's kept behind a locked gate for a reason of someone's, I don't know, aggrandizement or their ego or something. And it's kind of, well, the law keepers in Scotland, they don't exist anymore. There's the storytellers who maybe kind of come close, and some of the traveling communities come close, but we lost all of that kind of traditional cultural stuff. It was kind of, and this is the, I guess the political point is that, like, if Scotland was a country, we were part of the British project, and we moved with the clearances, and that way of life was removed through the Reformation and what followed. So you could kind of argue there were more Scottish traditions, whatever you want to kind of then view Scotland was before that, that have been scattered to the winds with the people as well. But I think what is beautiful personally, and this is my point of view, is that blend of traditions and ways of life and way of understanding, and that kind of blends nicely into the idea of hospitality and reciprocity and how we shared culturally. I think appropriative stuff is not a human natural way of life. I think it's kind of like brought on by living within quite a sick materialistic culture as well, that you will steal this to make money off of because it gives you clout, whereas we would probably never have done that because we didn't live within a kind of materialistic culture like that. We would have shared more. In traditional Scottish communities, like hospitality, it was really important because you couldn't do all the things at all, and like you knew if you shared, then other people would share with you, and then I think that kind of leads to the idea of the outcast witch. It's actually a death sentence because without your community, you wouldn't thrive at all. And we see that kind of borne out with the witchcraft trials. So there's like, yeah, I guess there's like a political way of answering that. There's like a human way of answering that. And there's a kind of a cultural way of answering that. And then there's a kind of exclusionary version of that too. And it's kind of why do we as people like to build walls between each other so much? I think it's not necessarily helpful. And to share a culture, I think, is to preserve a culture personally as well. None of this is rote, though. I see this is very my own opinion.
In some ways, culture is kind of what's created and shared between humans, not necessarily just, something that somebody's created a tick list of and gone, which ones of these do you? It's great. I suppose I'm not quite sure where I'm going with that, but do you know what I mean?
No, I like that because we're constantly creating folk customs and traditions all the time. It's just that people like to point to the past and call it a cultural artifact and say that it's whole. I think the best way I've ever come to understand it, I have a friend who is an amazing singer, Debbie Armour, and she is in a band called Birdell. And if you haven't heard them, you should go listen to them. They're just incredible. And we were talking about, well, Debbie was talking about singing songs, which are like folk songs. And someone asked, was like, why do you feel like it's okay to change that song? And Debbie very astutely answered, it's like, well, because we know that it's safe, it's recorded, everyone knows what the tradition behind it is. And I feel like I can play with that and make it my own because we know its lineage. Like, do you know what I mean? We know where it's come from. We know who sang it first, and we know the community. Like, it's very safe. And I think for me, that's the idea of like folk practices. If we know the why, the how can change. Do you know what I mean? It's like, well, we know why we do this. We know that this is a reciprocal thing. We know that this is a hospitality based thing to do. This is just building community stuff, trying to be very unspecific, but if we know like why we do those particular, like for instance, leaving milk on a stone, is it a good example, or cheese or whatever? Why do we do that? Because it's an offering, and in a reciprocal gift giving community, if you give, other people can give, and it starts to kind of create a circle of things. You give, so I give, so you give, so I give, and then we're recycling things in a community without having to spend money, if you know what I mean. And we see that exists in Gaelic culture in Scotland. I think it's called thigging. Can't remember now the Gaelic word for it, but people would give all the time, and there was an expectation we do that, and you see it echoed in all of the quarter days, I guess, like Beltane and Samhain. It's that kind of, it's the one day you're prescribed not to give anything away. which is really interesting. But you do give stuff away. We build community in a different way. So you see it kind of, these ideologies that seem like what's milk got to do with sowing, you suddenly see the connection between this kind of story of offering and gift giving. There's like the bigger narrative, I think, within those cross-quarter days that are about community and are about building bonds and stuff. So it's kind of from the small offering of milk on a stone, you can see it on a grander scale in communities and playing out that way. But yeah, sorry, totally lost track of the question. But the idea that there's an old artifact that we must keep safe, like, well, if there's only one copy of something, like if I have a story I see that's really great, I'm not going to keep it to myself, am I? I'm going to tell other people, and then I'll be like, now you can tell that story. Just tell people where you heard it, and then tell the story and tell it to other people, because this is like how we grow and share and learn from each other. And then we can't appropriate from something that everybody knows. So, like, I don't understand this idea why people want to keep things scarce. I can understand the fear that people might misrepresent it and try to make money from it, but it seems like a very strange mindset to have, that we don't share because we're scared that somebody might capitalize on it. It's kind of points to me that people have really bad opinions about other people, maybe realistic ones, I don't know, but it's that. So if I'm sharing something for free and then you've got somebody over here who's saying to learn this it costs 40 quid, what are you going to do? You know, because it's just common knowledge. It's a bit weird. It's a bit strange, but I see it often a lot. I think that people have their tradition that they are scared that will be watered down, but as we've already discussed, like, Scotland's a melting pot of different influences in different places, and the practices that you find in the Northeast you won't find in the Southeast, and vice versa. It's very different. To say that there's one practice would be weird, and the practice changes from families to communities to places as well. So there's no kind of like one way of doing something either, but the way we do it is standard pretty much, I would assume. Not that I've ever done a questionnaire across Scotland. What is this practice and why do you do it? It would be strange. But yeah, I like there's a sickness within this kind of withholding, and I think we need people to be safeguarded, yes, but I think they need to be safely ushered into it rather than guarded. What's the word? Yeah, ring fenced, or like kind of, yeah, gate kept is the word I'm looking for. I think safeguarding and ushering are nicer ways of kind of looking at gatekeeping. But who's, like, especially in the Scottish tradition, who's given that person permission to be a gatekeeper? Like, yeah, I don't know where that's come from either. Yeah, so I don't know. There's a lot in that, I think. Sorry, I've just totally rambled off, please.
No, that's fine. Because obviously we were talking again before we started recording about this idea of like a pan-Celtic world, where people will take like a deity that's evidence has only ever been found in like Gaul, and then go, "Ah, this is a Celtic god." Is it? How can you then have like a pan-Celtic belief of anything if most figures are quite localized? So on the back of that, obviously I know that there are other writers who've looked at Welsh traditions, for example, or Irish traditions, who do get a bit concerned, I think is the best word, when people take anything that's basically not English and then kind of say, right, that's Celtic, because it then erases the differences between them. And I think I always feel that this happens quite a lot with Wales, that it sort of gets kind of subsumed under everything else under the weight of Celtic. So do you get annoyed when people just kind of go, "Oh, that's like Celtic in air quotes"?
Like, it doesn't annoy me. That's too strong a thing. I went to university. I'm a working class person. I went to university, and it's the School of Scottish and Celtic Studies is a thing, right? So the word, when I grew up with the word Celtic as meaning people of Europe who were not Roman, basically. So I'm kind of like, I understand that as a phrase to be like that. And I understand there's a pushback because everyone decided that actually all Celtic people aren't the same. And I totally agree, they're not. But it's like the word for the collective, like we say Europe, like everyone in Europe is not the same. The European, it's like it's the same word, it's kind of same as saying European.
Yeah.
And a Euro, do you know what I mean? So for me, that's how I understand the word to mean. But I wouldn't be like, transferable stuff. So there's a caveat for that with me, is the way I view deity within my writing and tradition is very different, I think, from other conceptions of it. And I use like a euhemerist point of view, that the stories we have of gods are the stories of our people. They're not like up there or down there or around. They're not like, the word supernatural gives me a cringe as well, because that doesn't exist either in the Scottish folk tradition so much. So for me, oh gosh, where am I going? So let's start there, the euhemerist idea. So if you're saying there is a Celtic person who's this and it's generalized out, I would probably say like all of those Celts had a very similar need. And in each of those different areas of the different parts of, say, Wales or Ireland or Scotland or Cornwall, even Isle of Man, Brittany, all of this stuff, you probably will find a thing or a spirit or an ancestor deity or an ancestor god that has a similar function, because we as humans have similar needs. So you'll always find something related to the harvest and something related to love, and no. But how that is expressed culturally will be different in each of those areas. So there's the universal human story here, which is a beautiful thing. I think we all have a lot in common, but how that is expressed at a kind of regional level will be different. So like we have the Cailleach stories here, and interestingly enough, she's not one of the Tuatha De Danann, like she's something else. So there's that to think about, and then we need to start thinking about the hierarchy within the system that we're in. So we have many stories recorded from the castle and the church, which is what I mean by the kind of like top level stuff. And you'll know this, I see in history, that's kind of like what we have loads of evidence of. And then underneath that, we have the stories from kind of priests and warriors. We have to know what we don't know very much about actually is just working class stories and working class belief. And for me is these individual places with names and these mysterious things. These are the names of deities or ancestor gods, if you take that kind of euhemerist view of that particular region and that particular working class people whose stories we don't know anymore. It's kind of been forgotten. So if we kind of combine those two together, we all have universal needs, we all have similar things in common, but how they are expressed is very different. But we tend to kind of just hang on to those stories of the castle and stories of the priesthood stories, which were like, we start to generalize out, because there's loads of like stories of the druids wheeling around such and such gods through all of these things. That is the gods of the elite, in my opinion. They're not the gods of the working classes. And if someone could build a temple to somebody, there's got shifty lucre like going on underneath it. They had plenty of clout, right? And I guess like I kind of compare it to the idea of is it the Lares, the kind of Roman idea of the head of the household, and you just have like household spirit, and they were just down to the household, and we don't really know what they were or who they were, or were they ancestry, were they a bit of both or all things. um so so it doesn't annoy me. I totally get that people need to use a word that's generalized, but in terms of the different mythos getting mixed up and stuff, it can get a bit frustrating, because for me, it's because we start to lose the story of the people behind it. And also, if we start to believe that they're these kind of deities in the conceptualization that we've inherited from Christianity, I think we're kind of veering off a little bit. I very much view the gods of Scottish tradition and folklore as deified dead most of the time, and I think for me the beauty in that is, and people will disagree with me and they'll tell me that I've just been a heretic, but the beauty for me that is we forget that we're in nature. Like we seem to think dead and nature are completely different, and I'm kind of like, we're not. We are actually nature. We're kind of nature experiencing itself, and the dead go back into nature. And we are nature. Why can we not communicate with ourselves? Why is there the dead and why is there the land? Why are they different? Why are we not? back together again. And I think we need to start to tell different stories about how we connect around that kind of ideologically wise. And I think animism is one of the roots into that, and I think features hugely in Scottish folk practice as well. So a big answer for a small question, I see, maybe, but yeah, I can see why people get annoyed.
Yeah, I think for me, it probably possibly comes from like that, drive for categorization. But I think it's also it's more, I think, for me, when they do mix up the mythoses and then you sort of find a Celtic pantheon and you're like, but people at the time wouldn't have been picking and choosing between them in the same sort of way. And it is that kind of the modern internet conception of something. And if that's how you experience them, great. But don't then project that backwards in a way that it maybe wasn't believed. So I think that for me is the thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. And for me, it's kind of like the stories that I know are like the guy who wants to build a shed is not praying to Manon MacLear because it's by a loch. He's speaking to the actual loch, and the loch has a name, and we have records of the names of the spirits in the loch, and it's that kind of Manon MacLear can do whatever. Poseidon, whatever you want to, like, wherever you are in the world with that. But what's more important is the connection between that man and that space, or that person in that space, never mind their gender. And it's that direct communication that's really, really important. And I think if you conceptualize that the way that you do, fine. But as long as it's about that connection, then we're all heading in the right direction, I hope. But yeah, we're not going to call on the sea because we want to build on the loch. Doesn't make any sense, does it? Just like intuitively, like, nah, I'm not gonna
No,
do
I'm
that.
just kind of laughing. So I'm thinking of all the times when I've been very, very nice and polite to the printer at work, so it'll actually do what I want, and then it does. So, but there, I think this is, I think it's the idea. If you see yourself as sort of part of like the ecosystem and the wider community that you're part of, and I know this is stuff that previous guests have touched on as well. When obviously Althea's been talking about animism, and I know Amaya and Emma and Mara and Una actually all talked about the same thing. And it's always really nice when the same threads kind of come out, that actually if you think about yourself as part of a local system rather than, but anyway. So obviously we talked about deities there, and I was looking through your site, and one of them really caught my eye because like I knew the name but not really any of the story, which I think seems to be quite a lot of the problem with what we've just discussed, the fact that you can hear you don't get to hear the stories of all of the figures. But I really liked the stories and the idea of Nick Nevan. So who is she and how is she sort of important within sort of Scottish law?
Oh, like there's two camps on this, and I'm like, oh, this is the tricky one, isn't it, Izzy? Well, it brings to life what we're talking about, I think, actually quite beautifully. Nick Nevan appeared. I'm gonna get all of my facts and dates wrong because I'm not sitting reading off a script or anything, but she appeared in a kind of, it was Montgomery's flighting poem. Nick Nevan numbers a crew, something about a clue, which is something like a bawdy poem. And then later on, she appeared in another poem by another guy who was a posh guy, and was conflated with the Scottish Hecate, weirdly enough. Um, and then people kind of have ran with that. They're like, Nick Nevan is a Carlin. She's like the queen of the Scottish witches. La da 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 da. Okay, that's one side of the story. So I was really curious. I'm a really curious person, actually. I see, and I like to be like, this is really interesting. I don't like to take things on a level that's read. Like if someone says something on the internet, I will dig into it. Someone says something in an academic paper, I will look. I will read all of their references, and I will keep going until there is no more but a Wikipedia entry of 2 sentences. So I was like, this is really interesting, especially kind of given the Isabel Gowdy confession and her moon water, and it seems to be a Persian. Anyway, total tangent. We'll not go down there. So I was like, who is this person? And actually, there is a real Kate Nicknevan who was, is it Murray? She was kind of one of the first women to be killed in the witchcraft trials, actually. So she kind of became a bit of a poster girl, I think, for the witchcraft trials. And there's various bits of evidence. There's a whole article I've written about it on my website called The Wild Witch Chase, if people want to kind of Google it, because I'm not going to do it justice to the research that's been carried out on that. And she was a person who, there's two versions of this story too. And all stories have so many versions, right? Where do you go? Who do you believe? One, she was a lover of a lord, and she was being burnt at the stake for witchcraft, and she spat this blue pill out of her mouth and said, as long as you have this bit of jewelry, love, you'll be all right. Another one is that as she was burning, she cursed this place. I think it's the Lord of Monzy. Again, don't at me if I've got that wrong. And so she was a real person who was killed for witchcraft. And you can kind of understand how then that played into Montgomery's flighting and around the kind of witchcraft trials and stuff like that. And it's true, there's like Cailleach, Nevan's crag and stuff. You can find them on maps. You can even see where she was burnt to death. But interestingly enough, I think the Lord, if it was the Lord of Monzy again, excuse me if I get it wrong, he died childless after he removed this bit of jewelry because of an estate sale, and he died somewhere abroad, childless and crazy, which is kind of like, oh well, what a shame. But yeah, so the idea of Cailleach Nevan was two versions. There's the kind of I'm a witch and I want to believe that this is a thing version, and then there's the historic, there is a woman who died horribly version. But both of those kind of prove what we've just been talking about in terms of like how something localized can become a bigger story and actually have a global appeal. Because there's people across the world who believe that Nevan is their deity and has goblins at their side and rides at the front of the wild hunt and stuff. Whereas there is Nick Nevan, the person who died horribly. So in my mind, it kind of actually proves what I've been talking about, that idea of dead to deity quite eloquently. Actually, it's like, well, it's a real person who died who then became this kind of grotesque version of a story about herself and was kind of leading the wild hunt because she was the poster child of the witch hunts at that time. And I mean poster child in the kindest way as well. I don't mean it in a kind of visceral way, but yeah, one of the first to kind of suffer that punishment. So take that where you want, I guess.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned about sort of the idea of the dead going on and doing something else, because obviously I noticed there was quite a lot of content about ancestors as well. And I think it's been like the last few years mostly that there's been a lot of talk about like ancestor work in inverted commas sort of being thrown around in spiritual circles. And some people are quite woolly about what that actually means for them and so on. So would ancestor work as it's sort of commonly prescribed sort of now have actually been recognizable in Scotland in earlier centuries, or were there sort of specific practices related to ancestors or their veneration within Scotland?
Okay, so that I have a version of this story, haven't I always? So if we look at euhemerism, the idea of place gods or like people who died in places later become revered or worshipped, you could probably make the case for any Scottish folk practice is actually a form of ancestor veneration, if that's the case. And you can see this with the king lists and all of this kind of stuff where families link their lineages right back to a mythic ancestor. What's mine? Okay, I'm a McNaughton and like a sept of it. You don't need to know all of the names, but McNaughton, the clan McNaughton links itself back to Necton, which is itself like you'll have Necton's well, and all of this stuff is quite a huge mythic figure. But also, was real to the clan McNaughton, right? It's their kind of mythic ancestor. So that's one version of it. So these characters live within the other world, the kind of like the Aushi, the fairy community, I guess. And I don't like using the F word at all. But the otherworld community, and the otherworld community is made up of as many different people as ours is, and the dead are part of that kind of community. But if you're looking at this kind of from dead to deities situation, we can see how it's only natural that actually if I'm talking to this particular space where this particular person is buried, it's both ancestor veneration and land veneration at the same time. There's no not one or the other. We're doing both at the same time. Another example is about the Glastig. And the Glastig story is a really interesting one. And actually, it's my friend Eileen Budd who tells this story. She tells it beautifully, but the Campbell in the Gaelic Otherworld as well talks about this figure who is a kind of chases your cows to make sure that they're safe.
Mm.
And Eileen's story, and in Campbell's version of the story, she starts as a person who gathers, I think Campbell said, gathers a fairy nature and becomes this kind of protector of the herds and things like that. So it's somebody who's moved from dead to, you might argue, bioregional kind of representative, where we would leave that when we're talking about milk offerings, it would be on those stones that we would leave milk offerings to the Glastig and stuff. You probably know this story, I see. So we have examples where, if we're talking about ancestor veneration, it's actually already baked in what we're already doing, and it's already baked in our, or my conception in the tradition that I know, within the Aoshi community. There's no differentiation between land and dead and all of that kind of stuff. It's kind of the same thing, but they're kind of linked, distinct at the same time. So I think by showing hospitality and reciprocity and telling the stories and showing this kind of gifting stuff, it is a natural mechanism of that already, because you're making those connections and you're kind of moving forward at the same time. So for me, there isn't really like Samhain is going to be killer for it, isn't it? I'm going to see all the posts about ancestor veneration time. That should be totally cool. But also in Scottish folklore and folk belief, the ancestors and Aoshi are present at every single festival. They're not just, they just don't suddenly appear at one and then disappear again. They're kind of always current. And it ties us into that kind of community again, where we're giving offerings at certain times of year, not just the human community, but the otherworld community, which is made up of all sorts of different things. So yeah. So in my view, it's kind of already part of the practice. It's not like a separate thing that sits alone from it. But and I like that, because for me there is no separation between like the land and the dead. Like for other people there might be, but I think that's a view that we've encountered from Descartesian philosophy type church and state kind of, you know what I mean, neither the twain shall meet. And I don't feel that that was ever like a natural occurrence for us. But I feel like we've lost the way with that, and I do feel people malign the good folk a lot. And I think part of the reason why they are maligned is because it's kind of like they got really bad PR through the years to be like, we don't want you talking to your ancestry like that, but what we'll do is we'll give you saints which will do the same job. And I've noticed there's been a surge of like saint relationships happening in the kind of social media world, which is really interesting, because for me they provide a very similar function, but like a sanctified version of that, which of course you can access through the church and not your own personal relationship, which I disagree with, but there we go.
So obviously one of the big questions that I'm always going to ask, because I'm a complete research nerd, which I think everybody knows.
Yeah.
Where do you do your research? Because you've got so much stuff on your website. So I'm like, where do you find all this stuff?
I am really nosy. That's all I'm gonna say. I'm just really nosy. There's a story behind this, I guess, I see, and it's like one I'm really, really passionate about. Is like, as I said, like I'm working class. I'm the first kid in my family and ever to go to university, right? So my mom's Scottish, my dad's English. I was born in Oban. No jobs for my dad there, so my dad moved down to England. Hereford and Worcestershire is where we were brought up. So lived there and then left when I was 17 and moved roundabout to move back to Scotland because of love, as you do as a fool. So I've lived here a really, really long time. And why I'm telling you that story is because my mom, being Scottish when she was English, she was really ashamed of her like Scottish heritage, right? She wouldn't share stories or anything. My gran was a bit mean as well. Like, you know, I don't know what was going on there. But as soon as she crossed the border, she would all be like, a wee this, a drama that. And then like she would re-Scotify. That's probably not a word. But then I was like, this is really weird. I don't like, I knew a lot about English culture growing up. I grew up in English language culture. I learned French and German over Welsh and Gaelic, which I find really weird. We have like so many other languages we could choose to, like, why am I learning French? What's the, no offense to the French, but like, wouldn't it be nice to learn languages of like where you came from or your ancestry? Long story short, Icy, sorry, I realized taking up airspace is when I went to university, I suddenly realized there's all of these massive archives sitting in offices that nobody goes in a damp basement, and there's like a key, or like, you know, they've digitized them now. I've just aged myself massively by saying damp basement and a key and those rolling massive things that you have to roll around. And I was like, holy heck, this is like actually the stories of my mom's culture and my culture and stuff. So I kind of really dug into it and really, really enjoyed it. And then I was like, why don't people know this? Why don't we know? Why didn't I wasn't taught Scottish history at school? Like I was taught like the history of the royal family, which is bizarre when you think about it. Because like I'm a working class kid, right? I don't care what Queenie What's-it got up to. I'd rather know other stuff. And like the fight and the rebellion and all of this kind of stuff. Didn't know any of this. Didn't know any of the kind of stories about multiculturalism or anything. Like it was really like a really kind of, I call it the British project. It's a white British project, isn't it? It's like that. This is you are the victor and stuff. And even in our own country, we have like, it's not the full picture at all. So yeah, I found all these archives, like the School of Scottish Studies, and then I found out you could access like Alexander Carmichael's actual field notes. And I was like, this plethora of stuff just kind of opened up. And I still have all of those connections now from university. So that's kind of, I kind of lurk and get involved and go and follow breadcrumbs and stuff like that. And I read everything. I read a lot, because like you never really know when one thing suddenly kind of chimes with another thing. And it's really like my background is in social work and psychology, and I find it's very kind of the roots in to that through Scottish cultural archives, and the stories of the people are huge. And that's what really interests me, is that how did what we know how does that apply today, and how can we shift where we're heading? Because it's not, from what I'm getting, it's not, we're not heading in the right direction at the moment at all, culturally or ecologically. So how do we apply that? And yeah, applied folklore, we should maybe make that like a degree subject.
I'm all for that.
Can you imagine the field experiments? It would be wild.
Probably all the stuff that I do just to see if it works.
Lots of people in woven hats in a field dancing to make sure that, like, yeah, is this field going to be more fertile than the one we did no dancing in? Yeah.
Yeah, because you need your control field, don't you?
Yeah, you do need a control field. Yeah.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I'm currently writing a book on like love divination and love magic, because it's like my personal pet thing. And the number of them that I've tried, it's not even funny. But you go, one of them's got to work by all the laws of averages.
What's the most weirdest one that you've come across?
I mean, the weirdest one I've come across involves like a strip of skin from a corpse's arm. That one obviously is not on the bucket list. And like ethical considerations and all sorts. But I'm talking about like the really basic ones, like tying a bit of your hair around a cherry tree, or doing things with your shoes in different arrangements before you go to bed, like stuff that I can do without potentially breaking the law. That would be that's kind of
I think that's very safe. Yeah, there's like, it's actually amazing how much the spirits of the dead feature in love magic, actually, or coercive magic. It's like huge. I think we inherited a lot from the Scandinavians. Sorry, Scandinavian, but yeah, I think that's their influence. There's a lot of that in the black books as well. Like there's the graveyard book, if you've ever read it. It's really great. So it sounds like a Neil Gaiman book. But it's like, it's got a hand on the front. I can't remember who wrote it. It did like the whole treatise on the Svartscom book of books. Like it's huge, really great stuff. And he picked out all of the things that used like bits of dead bodies to this graveyard book. See if I can find it for you. I see. At least
thanks.
You can have a read.
I've just
Not to be tried at home though, right?
I've just got visions of like a new Netflix series, so it would get cancelled after one series, so it's fine. but like somebody who like ends up trying to conjure the dead to sort of make somebody fall in love with them, and then the ancestor's like, oh babe, they're not the one for you, and then they become like this weird sort of like agony aunt. I just think that would be brilliant.
Yeah, that would be cool. That'd be very good to be like, oh honey, we're gonna try something else. We're gonna go bigger. We're gonna go better. Yeah, that would be good.
Oh yeah, as I say, it would only get a series, so you know.
It would, after what happened to Chaos, right? It's so sad.
But obviously, to come away from Netflix and their weird system cancelling things after a series. Obviously, you've also got a Kickstarter going at the moment
I do.
about Scottish folk magic. And when does that run out again? Because I know you're like fully funded already.
It's I'm actually blown away by how much support. It's like I was like, it was funded in 24 hours. I see, it was amazing. And now we're at like over 200% funded, which I'm super grateful for. Like, yeah, like blown away. It means that I get to do an audiobook version and all of this stuff, and it's like pay proper money to proper artists to do stuff. I have a whole thing we could talk about self-publishing, but we won't go there today. But I'm just really pleased that I have creative control over it to kind of circumnavigate that situation. So it runs out on the 10th of November, I think, just before Martin Mass. And you can pledge. You can pledge for a book or a signed copy of a book or a badge or a poster, or come and attend a workshop, or have a Q&A with me about kind of some of these things, and could talk a bit more freely about some of the stuff you might have questions about away from the internet. So there's all of that happening. There's also going to be now an audiobook version voiced by Eileen Budd, who, if you haven't heard Eileen storytelling this, she has a voice, I can't say, of honeyed butter. It's just really, really nice. And we looked at how long the book's going to be. Audiobook version, it's going to be 14 and a half hours. So thanks, Eileen. She's going to be so sick of it by the end of it. Oh my gosh, I never want to read this ever again. But that's all thanks to the support of people who've been supporting the Kickstarter. So yeah, it's like brilliant. Thank you so much for kind of trusting in it. And the book itself is going to be a very nice object, because we've made enough to put all the fancy kind of like painted end papers and ribbons and end ribbons and all of these things that I am working with my designer and learning very, very quickly about all the nuance with it too. And it also means that I've managed to source a really environmentally sound printer as well. I had no idea, I see, how environmentally damaging printing books could actually be. So that's been a learning curve for me too. But all of these things are really important. Obviously, if you're writing a book about these kind of things, that about land connections and stuff, you don't want to be like, and here's a toxic book just to stop it all off with. But yeah, so it's going to be about Scottish folk belief and folk magic, and it's in 3 parts. And it talks first part's very much about the history. The second part is very much about the why rather than the how. We've got loads of books about how, I think. But the reasoning behind it, some of the things we've talked about today are in that. And part 3 is all of the folk traditions that go into the folk calendar of the year, that kind of bring it all to life across the year for the readership. So yeah, it's like a tome. it's over 320 pages or something at the moment.
So would this be something that someone could sort of pick up and establish a practice from, or would it be to inform an existing practice, would you say?
It's not a folk magic 101 how to book. It's very much it's academic, but written in an accessible way, and it's very historically based. So it talks about the reasons why we are in the state that we are in with things, and it talks very much about those kind of like foundation notes of a folk practice, that if you are a folk practitioner or do practice, you could probably look at kind of developing. But it also talks about Scottish culture and how it kind of grew from some of these beliefs and some of those kind of values and ways of being in the world. And it's a bit literature, there's some stories, there's some kind of ecology messages and in it about like relationships and stuff. So it does a bit of kind of everything. So it's quite a hard book to pitch to a publisher who wanted it not to be that part, but this part, and then other one wanted, yeah, you can imagine. It's literal nonfiction. Like, what even is that? Like, doesn't exist. So yeah, like it's a big book, and I think people who've got an interest in Scottish culture and Scottish folk belief get a lot from it. But it's not going to be like every full moon roll up your trouser leg and get your three nipples out or anything like that. It's got none of that kind of content in it. But that might follow, because I have a lot of that how, but I think the why is probably more important for people to kind of grasp. And it's my hope that actually people will disagree with me, argue with me about it, because we need to move the conversation forward in a way that's based in a historic academic basis rather than stuff that's maybe not so academic or has kind of been debunked a little bit or kind of moved beyond. So I hope it's kind of a little bit foundational for people too, and a little bit challenging as well, because I'm not sure everyone's going to agree with everything that's written in it. But why write what everyone wants to read, right?
Well, I mean, I for one am definitely here for more books with that historical basis to what they're presenting, because I find some books, older books in particular, I should actually specify, a lot of sort of current authors are much better doing this. A lot of the older ones just kind of all regurgitated what they were all saying. So if one person had relied on a particular author who we were already laughing about earlier, who just came out with whatever she wanted, and then everybody else then follows, and everyone's just no one's ever stopping to think, is that actually correct? And they're all just saying the same thing. I think that having that historical basis sort of returns the people back into these beliefs rather than kind of this weird over romanticized myth about how some of this stuff actually works in practice.
Yeah, and it was a pleasure to explore and research. Like it's 12 years of writing, so I've been at it for a while. But to draw on kind of like Scottish academics as well, there tends and people who've come from Gaelic speaking language culture too, and they disagree a lot with English academics who don't speak Gaelic for the reason that they're immersed in the language culture. And to be able to bring some of that kind of discourse into it, it's been really, really interesting, and I think vital as well to kind of challenge some of that overculture kind of discussion. I think it's just really, really needed. But yeah, I'm excited to get it out. Hopefully, all going well, it should come out in February. But the hardback copy is going to only be available through the Kickstarter. And then I have to find ways of distributing it that aren't awful after that. Oh, wish me luck.
Well, it's been absolutely marvelous speaking to you. Obviously, I'll put links in the show notes and what have you, because obviously, you know, how else will people find it? And if anyone does want to pledge, even, and I suppose the advantage that you've got now is if someone wants to pledge, they know that they're going to
Yeah.
actually get the book. It's not one of those ones where it's just going to sit there and you're like, is this going to actually happen or not? Like we know yours is, which is
Yeah,
really cool.
it's good. I'm like really excited to have. It's like with the editors at the moment, and I haven't had too many cringy edits back. Like it's good. Like there's a few when I've been like, do I really say that? But this is the power of having an editor, and this is the power of like the Kickstarter funds that helped me be able to get a really good editor and a really good designer on it. I wouldn't want to put out a book without a good editor. Oh my god. Worth their weight in gold. But it has made me realize, I see, how many people actually write their books? Is it like mostly the editor that fixes them? Like, I'm not saying my editor's done that. um, but yeah, it's wild, isn't it? The amount of kind of input that goes into actually like the finished published book is huge. So hats off to people who have self-published really good books without a kind of editor, because you're doing all the things, and I don't have the brain capacity for that. So yeah, just let you know you're all amazing if you've done that.
Cool. Well, it's been lovely talking to you, and hopefully people will come and support the book.
Yeah, you too, Icy. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.